Okay, good afternoon. Thank you so much for attending today. I'm Sarah Patterson. I'm a demographer and sociologist here at the Survey Research Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Deadric Williams to ISR today. I would like to start out by thanking Dr. Williams for his visit, as well as the DEI Educational Working Group. And then, these events always happen because of multiple people. So I'd like to thank Anna, Tara, Miriam, Zach from CMT, as well as many others from the Educational Working Group. So this talk is a part of the Inclusive Research Matters series, which illustrates ISR's commitment to examining the role of inclusion in the research process itself. The idea for the seminar series arose from discussions within the DEI Educational Programs Working Group, focusing on inclusion in research methodology. So talks explore things like the measurement of constructs across intersectional identities, as well as assumptions and decisions that impact sampling, representation, and the selection of research topics. So today, Dr. Williams will be presenting his research on racial disparities without racism, some conceptual and analytical considerations. So just to give you a brief overview, Dr. Williams is an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, where he's also the director of the Center for the Study of Black Families and Children. They just got a new website, so check them out. His research and teaching focuses on race and racism, Black families, poverty and economic hardship, stress and health, and quantitative methods, including longitudinal and dyadic analyses. Dr. Williams is a WT Grant Scholar from 2022 to 2027, and also serves as a deputy editor of the Journal of Marriage and Family. So without further ado, I'll hand it over. Oh, and sorry, one procedural thing. So he's going to talk, so please hold your questions to the end, and then I'll bring the mic to you. And if you're online, please put them in the chat, and I'll read them out. Thank you so much.
Testing. Can everyone hear me in the back? Pretty good. Awesome. Thank you all for being here. I want to believe that you're here for me and not the free food in the back. But if that's the reason you're here, thanks for coming as well. I want to give a special shout out to Sarah for inviting me, for all the labor that she has done to help me. I appreciate you so much. I also want to give a shout out to the people who do all the behind the scenes work, like make these screens and my presentation possible for you all to see what I have to say. And so hats off to them as well. I am going to cover some ground here, and I want to make sure I have time enough to cover that ground so that there can be questions at the end, or I can talk for a whole hour and you can email me your questions. But I want to get done in a timely fashion so that we can have a dialogue around these particular issues. It's good to be back in Ann Arbor. Once upon a time, I was here 12 years ago. Wow. I took this picture the last day I was here for ICPSR. I spent 2 months in the lovely summers of Ann Arbor. So the drive in and looking at the places I used to visit and the house I stayed in during those 2 months was somewhat emotional for me, because my intellectual training, particularly around quant methods, is a byproduct of the University of Michigan, particularly ICPSR. Also, a little bit about myself. I'm trained as a family sociologist, demographer, and I have done several different things, and I'm doing something dynamically different than what I started. So I wanted to understand stress and health largely from a dyadic perspective. That is, think about intimate couples, particularly heterosexual couples, because my critique of family sociology at the time as a grad student, and as grad students, we're almost like automatically critique everything. And my concern was that for many sociology studies on family, it was really about one person giving information about the whole entire family. And much of the readings I was doing to understand dyadic data analyses were out of psychology. So psychologists have been doing this kind of stress and health as a dyadic process for some time. Yet, among sociologists, there is this issue of representative representative samples, whereas many psychologists were using small n sizes, 20 couples to understand, or 20 to 50 couples, right? And I really wanted to understand how stress and health evolves over time in the context as children age. So much of this work in my dissertation was using the Future of Families data, formerly known as the Fragile Families data, looking at both the mothers and the fathers, how stress in one person affect their own health, but how stress in one person can also affect the health of their partner as well. So again, those particular set of analyses I was concerned with was, again, how does stress and health change or stay the same over time as children develop via age, right? Then I was at the University of Nebraska for my PhD. I stayed there to do a postdoc in minority health disparities. I got involved in health in a more nuanced way by looking at biomarker data. So I'm very interested in things like cortisol, alpha amylase, because I'm really concerned about, in these projects, how does stress get under the skin to impact physiological health response systems, right? Looking at both biomarkers and ambulatory assessments, I was really concerned about the day-to-day interactions, particularly Black couples have throughout the day, whether that be at work, whether that's friendship networks, whether it's their relationship with their partners. Again, really trying to understand stress and health as a dyadic process. Now, as an aside, and I share with many of the people I've talked to throughout the day, is that I did not want to do the race work. I'm gonna let that sit for just a second. Largely because scholars of color often get pigeonholed of doing one particular thing, and that's all they can do. So much so that I remember instances in graduate school where people were asking me about the race stuff, but go to somebody else about the statistic stuff. Like, wait a minute. I took a comprehensive exam in family demography and quantitative methods. I know a little something about statistics as well, right? And just to go back to that picture of me sitting in front of the University of Michigan, when I went back to Nebraska, everyone had already taken their exam. So I was in this small room for 6 hours by myself, answering questions on quantitative methods, the assumptions of OLS, all that stuff, right? But that really surprised me that no one would want to come to me to talk about statistics or help with statistics, as if I'm not supposed to know anything about statistics, right? And again, part of the work I do now is largely because there was a flashing neon light in which family demographers and sociologists wasn't really thinking about race and racism in nuanced ways. So what ended up happening is that during my postdoc, I read a bunch of stuff, this tricky term called CRT, and really took a deep dive in this particular line of research and really wanted to have a conversation. I wanted the conversation between race scholars with family scholars to be integrated. And much of my work I do now is really to present a critical understanding of the role of race and racism in family research, particularly family inequality. And much of this, as someone who is trained as a cointoid, I really got involved in theoretical development. And as you'll see throughout this presentation, that in my own training, there seems to be a disconnect between learning quantitative analyses and good theory. It's as if somehow we leapfrog over the theory to show how parsimonious our methods are in the relationship between variables. I got a little dramatic there, sorry. That's how it was understood to me, right? And so I wanted to take the time to theorize racism in the context of family life and then employ methods that made sense to make sense of the questions I was asking, how to analyze data, and to what extent to draw a set of conclusions based on the theoretical perspective that I am guided by in the particular research. So theory and methods in the context of CRT and data analytics has become my baby now. And so the guy who didn't want to do the quote unquote race research is that guy that does race research, largely because the field of family demography and family sociology lacked a critical perspective around racism and race. And I started to ask, if not me, then who? Now, before I get into this talk, I want us to be on the same page. So there's going to be some terms and ideas and phrases I'm going to use throughout the presentation, but I want to make sure that you understand what I mean. So for those of you who follow me on Twitter, know that I say people racialized as Black or people racialized as white. I don't say white people and I don't say Black people, largely because I care about race as a socially constructed idea. The idea of saying Black people and white people run the risk of reproducing essentialist understanding of racialized bodies. So I don't expect anyone else to say it. I do this on purpose because the point of emphasis is on the process by which race becomes a thing, not as if race is a given. Second, I'm upfront with my definition of structural racism. I'm going to move behind this podium because I feel myself being claustrophobic. So if I'm being recorded, I'll move back and forth for convenience sake, but I feel like a mannequin right now, just sitting in front of you. So my particular definition of structural racism is an ongoing, ever-changing system of ideologies and structures that does three things. Thank you. Structural racism does three things. It makes the ideal of race seem real. It disproportionately benefits people of the dominant group. And lastly, it disproportionately disadvantages people of the subordinate group. I'm going to use the term anti-Blackness a ton, particularly structural anti-Blackness. It's basically the same definition in the structural racism, but with a focus on people who are racialized as Black vis-a-vis people racialized as white. So it is a specific form of structural racism that focuses explicitly on the history and the contemporary understanding of people who are racialized as Black. This is where I started to use this phrase because it was overwhelmingly surprising that people often think that when you talk about race, you're talking about the minorities, or better yet, the Blacks. This is not it. Race is not a shorthand for the minorities or for the Blacks. And there's often a misunderstanding of the idea of racism as if racism needs to be intentional. So intentionality is not a necessary condition for the maintenance of white supremacy and anti-Black racism. It is sufficient, but not necessary. What most of us know in this room is that health disparities, for example, is a social fact. We know that because we have the data to indicate it as such. So when we look at cardiovascular disease, we see racial disparities in a host of outcomes, from blood pressure to strokes, from diabetes, even at younger ages. We also know pregnancy-related mortality varies across race. We also know that education is not necessarily the great equalizer when it comes to these disparities in health. In fact, in some studies indicate that having high levels of education, if you're racialized as Black and woman, is actually a higher disadvantage of a pregnancy-related death. And we also know infant mortality varies by race as well. But we also know And I'm putting these statistics up purposely because this is the work I do. I do health disparities work and economic disparities work. So when we look at economic disparities as a social fact, we know that poverty varies across race. We know that economic hardship, those having a hard time paying one's bills, one's rent and mortgage, etc., varies across race, and that variation exists over time. And we know that income, particularly among Black and white families, also vary, and that variation persists over time as well. Now, I'm saying this to an audience that I assume already know this. You don't have to answer that. That was a rhetorical question. While most reasonable people, and I'm using the word reasonable on purpose, while most reasonable people would not debate whether or not disparities exist in person, the debate often emerges around why. So why do we have persistent health disparities? Why do we have persistent economic disparities? And for this talk, I'm only going to talk about the Black and white because that's the work that I do. And I often say this in my talks as well, is that because I do this for a living, asking me about another racialized group is almost an insult. There are scholars who do that work. I am not that scholar, right? And so any questions about racialized groups outside of Black-white disparities, I leave it up to other scholars who do that work and do that work well. So I'm not going to answer a question about that because I don't want to run the risk of giving you faulty information, okay? So why does it exist? My argument, much of the work that I do is really trying to grapple with this relationship between race and racism. I like puzzled looks. Just always get these puzzled looks. So yes. So if I were to ask you, do you think that race leads to racism? A, or does it B? Racism leads to race. Who would say A? No fair. This is not fair. My audience, this is selection bias. I know. Who say B? Right? B. Right? But this particular relationship is important because it illustrates how you answer this question, allows you to interpret the world in very divergent ways. But many people who think that race leads to racism often comes at this particular idea from an essentialist perspective. And I tell you what that means in a second. For most of you who are social scientists, I'm assuming the selection bias is strong in this room, right? The social construction of race is a byproduct of racism itself. Thus, the idea that race is socially constructed means that it comes from a particular place and serves a particular set of purposes. So the race leads to racism. The essentialist perspective would often have a set of assumptions that most folks often take for granted. Is this idea that race is biologically, or if they want to get fancy, culturally real, right? And it's often taken for granted that people automatically fit in some neat category. And in the United States context, when a person doesn't fit into a particular category or become ambiguous, they're like, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Idaho. No. Where are you really from? I'm not from Idaho, by the way. So the idea here is that race is taken for granted. It just exists. You're born into a particular racial group. Next is racism is often seen as episodic. Racism, yes, slavery existed. Yes, Jim Crow existed. Yes, there's a killing of Black folks by cops, sure. But those are just a few bad apples. And racism is a thing that occurs and stops. So there can be racism events, right? Or racist events. And lastly, to understand racial inequality is often placed on the individuals themselves as a cause for the inequality. So yes, again, slavery existed. I'm not going to debate that. We all know that happened. Jim Crow, sure. But now, in the post-civil rights era, it's all on you. So, how does this relate to research? And what I argue in my work is that most of the analytics that we do, I'm gonna get in trouble for this, but I'm tenured now, so I can't believe I said that, I'm sorry. Most of the analytics we do have remnants of eugenics and essentialist thinking. So as the world, not terms, but as the world moved away from race as biology to a social construction, the way we analyze racial inequality have often stayed constant in terms of trying to, quote unquote, explain the racial gap. And I know many of you who are survey methodologists, this is what happens. So my research is not the data collection processes, but what happens when the data is already collected and you want to study racial inequality. So my work is really about getting a data set, whether it's primary data collection or some secondary data analyses that you want to do on a particular data set. I really are challenging scholars to think differently. So in a pre-civil rights era, from an essentialist perspective, they recognize disparities can be a byproduct of all of those things that happened before the civil rights era. But in the post-civil rights era, it's all about individualism. Again, this happened in the past, but the past is disconnected from the present. So, remnants of essentialism in quantitative research is often this question that really, really gets under my skin. And most conventional research, including my own, so I'm not separating myself from the larger research agenda as if because I am a byproduct, right? My training is a byproduct of that particular set of understandings. So we normally come to a particular research question asking, what accounts for the Black-white inequality? What accounts for the Black-white poverty gap, health gap? And here is a generic conceptual model that most of us learn in social research, right? When we talk about mediating processes, right? You got a race variable, you got some outcome that you care about, and you have a plethora of variables that we're trying to enter into the equation to answer the question, what accounts for the racial gap? How much variance, to get fancy, how much variance is explained, right? This particular idea is problematic because although the race variable and the outcome is the gist of the study in terms of understanding the disparities, once the scholars start talking about the mediating mechanisms, the paper becomes about that. Usually in terms of social or human capital. So here's a depiction of scholars looking for variables to account for the Black-white gap. Dating myself a little bit, or a lot of it. So is it the family formations? Is it culture? Right on roll. I'm glad you got that. I'm so glad you got that. Woo. I'm glad you got that. Right? Is it education? Right? Is it employment? Is it, my favorite, neighborhood disadvantage? In almost every study, it opens with some type of parade of disparities, right? On average, Black people are more likely to be poor than white people. Black people are more likely to be having health problems than white people. And then we start talking about these variables. Because the logic is that if racial variation exists in the X variable, then we're trying to account for the variation in the Y. That makes statistical sense. but it fails to make theoretical sense. I got you now. I feel it. I roped you in really, really good right now. So once we analyze the data, right, and none of our favorite variables is fully accounting for the racial gap, what must it be? Racism. It can't be anything else. We'll try all our favorite variables, and it's almost in every discussion and conclusion, oh, it must, and it's kind of like tongue-in-cheek type of way, racism must be operating. Oh, no. It's okay. For real, Sherlock? So my argument is, why wait to the end? Why not begin with racism? Because if race is really a socially constructed idea with a set of assumptions, then we must be upfront and transparent in those particular set of assumptions. Don't hide behind this phrase, race is socially constructed. Tell me what you mean, right? The racial groups are invented to standardize pre-existing inequality. The invention of racial categories was used as a way to justify oppression and domination, that racism is an ongoing feature, not episodic, not an event, but it's always ever changing. And third, contemporary racial inequality is inextricably linked to the creation of the categories themselves via laws, policies, social practices, even discourse and language serves as a particular structuring mechanism to maintain. I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. If we start with racism as a particular mechanism, to scholars who suggest that race is socially constructed, we should be leading with racism. So instead of asking the question, what accounts for the racial gap in a given outcome, I ask, what are the mechanisms via racism that maintains the black-white inequality? It's not as if people racialized as white and racialized as black were once equal and they became unequal. The inequality is the reason why we have historical racial categories. So racism cannot operate independently versus the conventional approach. So these particular approaches are not just a matter of difference in theoretical orientation or even opinion. They have real implications for how we do research, what questions we ask, the empirics, the results, how we interpret those results, how we conclude in terms of the relationship between variables. And I just want to highlight, again, this is not just simply a difference in one's theoretical orientation. In the absence of implications, they have real implications. So in 2019, Professor John Iceland wrote a piece in Population Review and Policy Research, Population Research and Policy Review, sorry, right? Race is a classic standard racial inequality and poverty demography piece. It is standard. Then me, at the time, being an overly ambitious assistant professor, wrote in response, asking or making a statement that we need to start talking about oppression and domination in the context of poverty and persistent poverty. And Professor Iceland had room in the journal to respond back to this over-energetic assistant professor at the time. And what I want to do is read the abstract. And it says, the comment raises some thoughtful points but offers an approach to research on racial and ethnic differences, poverty, and influence by ideology rather than testable theory. Such an approach with its presumptions and internal contradictions ultimately do not offer a path to greater insight on these issues. I didn't take this personal, but I just thought it was good in the context of this. The debate opened a dialogue that wasn't personal, but an exchange of ideas. And I think that's the beauty of science. That's the beauty of theorizing. That's the beauty of empirics, right? It's about epistemology, not personal attacks. My response to Professor Iceland was that we're making assumptions about race without explicitly making assumptions about race. And as a byproduct of that, you lead the reader to have to make the conclusions themselves. And if a person reading the paper have essentialist interpretations of race and racism, then the argument is going to be, well, if Black people would just get married, they would be on par with the whites. So, because I'm overly ambitious, and I took Professor Iceland's words to heart, not in a personal way, but forced me to think more critically about the issue. And I dropped the year later, I dropped a book chapter in the introduction to Africana demography, in which I lay out a theory, since the argument was that this is not testable theory. Well, let me write a theory piece, in which I make the argument that we need to rethink how we think about the Black-white gap in poverty, because settler colonialism, the long arm of settler colonialism, still permeates the American imagination. And CRT, as a theoretical framework, can help us to understand the what and the why. I didn't stop there. I did an empirical paper too. Using CRT as a guidepost. And I'm gonna come back to this figure later, because I'm making another, a more nuanced argument later on in the presentation here. But my co-author, Regina Baker, who's at Penn, but now at UNC Chapel Hill now, wrote this piece in testing CRT as a theoretical framework against the conventional ways we think about research on race and poverty. Again, I'll come back to this. And here of late, I've been busy writing in a set of articles that recently came out, in which another theoretical piece on racism and the mechanisms maintaining racial stratification in Black families, which is going to be the conceptual model that guides this work today, right? Racial disparities, which is the name of this presentation, right? Without racism, and then what is Quant Crit doing in a nice field like family science, right? In which the team of us talked about how can we use CRT as a way to deliver quant methods to create a more equitable science. So in this piece, racism and the mechanisms maintaining racial stratification in Black families, the conceptual model kind of leads this journey. And if you can't see it, I'm gonna help you see it with some conceptual considerations, right? And in this piece, I talk about the making of racial stratification, right? The manifestations of racial stratification and the mechanisms, like my alliteration, the making, manifestation, and the mechanisms, right? And I'm going to go over this point by point here. So first, what do I mean by the making of racial stratification? Although not presented on the screen, my work builds on settler colonialism as a framework to understand racial categorization. So for me, racism is composed of two things. Racism is not an individual egregious act against another person, but rather racism is composed of both ideologies, that is beliefs about race and inequality, and structures. So racism as ideology and structures make the idea of race possible. So racial groups can only exist because of racism. To separate them is like someone saying, hey, I like the H2 part of water. I don't like the O part. You can't disentangle because racial categories' very existence is a byproduct of pre-existing inequality that makes categories appear to be real. So these categories aren't merely just nominal variables that most of us are told in research methods, right? It's a nominal variable. I make the argument that it's categorical and a relational hierarchy. That is people who are racialized as white versus indigenous populations, people racialized as white versus those racialized as black, white and Latinx, white and immigrants. So although I recognize the importance of BIPOC and POC, I also make arguments that these particular terminologies have been co-opted in such ways that render invisible unique group experiences, right? And what I argue is that the ideologies and structures that shape the white and indigenous relationship is a different set of ideologies and structures that sets the black-white relationship. So when you put all the groups in one category, we run the risk of reproducing the very thing of why we got racial groups to begin with. Usa. So, if we have the making of racial stratification via settler colonialism, pre-existing inequality and oppression, racial groups emerge out of ideologies and structures that give the illusion that race is real. How do we get racial inequality? What are the pathways? I'm glad you asked that question. The first pathway, and all of this is happening simultaneously, but I have to deliver this in a way to help us to understand. I can't talk about things simultaneously. I just can't. But when racial groups become real or appear to be real, it sets in motion rules of engagement. So the ideological piece, the beliefs about race and racial inequality, get morphed into what we call prejudice, right? Or these hierarchical boundaries. For example, images like this isn't about individual people being individual races. They're responding to a society level understanding of racial inequality. This is normalcy. I feel like I'm preaching a little bit. I'm gonna turn it down a notch, or maybe not. But not only do we have the ideology getting converted into these boundaries, but the structures themselves morph into institutional barriers of what we may call discrimination. Once racial groups are formed, crystallized, made to appear as if it's real, it sets the stage for how humans relate to one another. Throughout American history, we have examples of discriminatory laws, from naturalization laws to Indian Removal Act, to Chinese Exclusion Act, Johnson-Reed, or the Immigration Act 1924, right? These are examples of institutional barriers that restrict access for some while simultaneously benefiting others. So these hierarchical boundaries and these institutional barriers can act independently or in tandem. But the goals are the same: to maintain racial inequality. So the manifestation from poverty to health to housing to segregation are all manifestations of the ideologies and structures that make the ideal of race real. And as an aside here, let's take incarceration as an example. we often want to study incarceration as an institution because it has deleterious effects on people, right? Families, children. My argument is we're studying the manifestation of racism, not the actual racism. Because the question becomes, the racism is the ideologies and structures. So it's not about the incarceration itself. That's why the debates are highly contested, because people are talking around each other and not to each other. So we have to step back and ask ourselves, what are the ideologies and structures that made the disproportion of Black people incarcerated to begin with? Same with poverty, same with wealth, same with housing. Because the perpetuation of racial stratification via human behavior and human interaction changes over time. How does that happen among people racialized as Black? Man, y'all asking really good questions today. So, if we think about ideologies and structures as a system, and the down arrow represents the dominant group usurping authority to below, and the up arrow is the subordinate group fighting for their rights and privileges in that particular system. We know during the slavery era, the ideologies were biological inferiority and superiority. And chattel slavery was the actual structure that governed the relationship. But a guy by the name of W.E. Du Bois, who wrote in The Black Reconstruction, has the general strike thesis in which he argues that enslaved persons, particularly men, fought for their own freedom as a way, they saw it as a way to get access to opportunity. So we have the Emancipation Proclamation, the so-called Great Equalizer, well, the Great Emancipator, right? But because racism is an ongoing process, once those changes are made, you can't enslave persons anymore, new ideologies and new structures emerge. Right? We get the Great Compromise of 1877, of when Rutherford B. Hayes become president, of a gentleman's handshake. You can become president if you take the federal troops out the South. And what happens when that happened? The establishment of Black codes and Jim Crow laws. New ideologies, it becomes cultural deficiencies now, right? Separate but equal, right? Then we get the civil rights movement as a way to protest against those oppressive systems. And once the civil rights movement happens, you have civil rights legislation, new ideologies and new structures emerge. Y'all got me preaching here today. This is my pastoral cloth. So racism doesn't end. It morphs and changes to fit the ideologies and structures of the day. And now we have Black Lives Matter movement as a way to protest against oppressive forces. That's often invisible because we don't have slavery and Jim Crow anymore, but we have a new set of policies, the war on poverty, we go to war with a lot of things, right? So, given this history, what are some ways scholars can theorize the Black-white inequality? Oh, right on time, right? And what I argue in my work is that these mechanisms actually work to maintain. And for disclosure, I'm also currently writing a book. And I'm going to talk about these particular 3 sets of mechanisms. There are more than these 3 sets, but I can only write about so much. The individual level characteristics, city-state structural racism, and tract level racialized space. I can talk with you one-on-one about what these mean, but for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to only talk about individual level characteristics. So, how can structural race inform our understanding of quant methods in racial inequality research? And here is the analytical considerations. Ooh. First, we need to distinguish between inequality as categories and inequality as processes. And second, understanding within group heterogeneity. right? What I mean about inequality as categories versus inequality as processes, right? Inequality as categories often gives us our what we call disparities, right? There's some gap, right? Gaps on gaps on gaps, right? And again, we often enter, a study often begins with a ton of statistics in the first paragraph because you're trying to rope the reader in that this is a real social problem. Then the very mechanism, as I talked about earlier, also varies, right? So if there's racial variation in poverty, and people with non-marital childbirth are more likely to be poor, and those people happen to be disproportionately Black, then the assumption is racial variations in family formations may account for the racial gap in poverty. Inequality as categories suggest that if people racialized as Black just enter this particular category, I mean, hell, we got whole policies that people are pushing people, well, in many ways, challenging people to get married as a policy recommendation. So inequality as categories is a real thing that scholars, laypersons, and policymakers think of. But what about inequality as processes? It's not about the extent to which Black people racialized as Black are married or not married. What are the processes that led to that variation in the first place? And when we focus on within group heterogeneity, we can help us move away from thinking of people racialized as Black as a monolith, right? And sociology, particularly urban sociology, has studied the heck out of poor Black folk. And there's been an increase in scholars studying middle class, people racialized as Black, right? That as a graduate student in sociology, I was like, man, are there no Black people with money? I mean, every study is like, I mean, it's in the title, right? Urban poor Black people, right? Sorry. Right? And what's unique about this particular approach is that we can isolate the mechanism that may be unique to a particular racialized group, given the history of that particular racialized group. And it's not just about people of color, it's also people who are racialized as white too. There's white heterogeneity in income and poverty, et cetera. So within group analyses isn't just about the people of color, okay? It's about understanding the processes that make the inequality possible. And lastly, we can provide insights across race studies. Instead of having racial groups in the same study, we can do them independently of each other, and certain mechanisms that may be germane for one group may not be germane for the other group. Then we can talk about specific policies that may be unique instead of universal. So when we get to these individual level characteristics, I'm giving you a quick empirical example on some of the work that I've done. Right? So in this study, I told you, I try not to lie, made a promise that I'll come back to this. We're back to it now. So in this study, we're asking the question, do family structures and risks intersect across racialized groups? And if so, do the risks for Black and Latinx mothers converge? That is similar effects with people racialized as white? Or do they diverge as different effects compared to white mothers? So inequality as categories, family structure is often framed as such. In families science, whether it's HDFS, family sociology, family demography, family structure is like marriage versus like marriage, cohabitating, singles, et cetera, right? Right? And usually, theoretically, it's often framed as a social capital, interpersonal group relationships, potential groups, right? Access to networks within one's own network, but also in their partner's network, right? Community resources and social structures, right? Marriage family versus unmarried families, we often dichotomize them, right? To these, again, inequality is seen as merely categorical. The presence or absence of people in a category. This has important racial implications because Black families are overrepresented in non-marital childbearing and poverty. And the logic, as I mentioned earlier, that if people didn't have out of wedlock birth and just got married and followed, I've written about this extensively, and follow the success sequence, then we can all be equal. Right? Also in these studies is often racial comparatives in which white Americans are often positioned as the standard against which people of color are even measured, right? Because most of us who do quant work, we have to leave out a particular variable. And I'm not suggesting that we leave out another variable. It's implied in the analysis. So if we think about inequality as processes and still use the same mechanism, we tell a different story. That is that marriage regulations in the United States dates back to the Reconstruction era. Right? We had marriage projects to domesticate free persons, right? We transfer responsibility from the economic support from the government to male household heads, even among men racialized as Black, although they were still subjugated in the economic structure. We had the man in house policies of the 60s that prevented adult men from living with women and children who received public assistance. And what these particular arguments, what these scholars show, and it's historians, legal scholars, and a few sociologists write about these issues, but it's often masked by the conventional ways we think about inequality and racial inequality and family structure. In terms of inequality as categories, it's disproportionately represented in social science research. And what these scholars argue, if you think about women racialized as Black, who've been enslaved persons, and they leave a state-sanctioned oppressive institution called slavery, only to enter a state-sanctioned oppressive institution called marriage. And what these authors argue is that people racialized as Black did get married, but many didn't because many Black women didn't see the benefit from being owned by someone else. And the general argument is that Black women have always been in front of a changing society and making. So we have, for instance, we have a rise in women racialized as white who have non-marital childbearing, right? But Black women been doing that, largely because they're adapting to a set of structures that often hurt them. So by the time we get to the civil rights, the post-civil rights era, new regulations emerge. The states interpret these adaptive strategies as these behavioral deficiencies. Unmarried births is viewed as the cause of poverty, right? But prior research shows that unmarried births are not the cause. I said American over-penalized non-marital births via welfare reform, right? As one study, Perlin shows that policies that focus on long motherhood in terms of policies. So when they spend money to prevent long motherhood, they end up taking money from TANF. So it actually increases the Black-white poverty gap instead of mitigating it. So in my results, we show that if we have racial groups in the same family structure with the same risk of being poor, like economic hardship, mental health, parental incarceration, lack of social support, right? And so we trichotomize into 0 risk, 1 or 2 risk, 3 or more risk. The assumption is if it's all about individual level characteristics, then we should see parity here. The probability of being poor, given a set of risk factors, should be the same across racialized groups. But what we find is that even when Black and Latinx mothers have 0 risk and marry, they still have a higher probability of being poor compared to women racialized as white with 3 or more risk. And that's just one example because of time. That's only an example I'm gonna give. When we think about racial inequality, particularly inequality as categories versus inequality as processes, we're telling different stories. So my question to the audience, what story do you want to tell? And in recommending my own work, I recommend you read this new book that came out of JMF, right? In which we talk about quant crit, the centrality of racism. Categories are constructed, right? We center counting areas and critique the dominant frames. Data are not neutral, no matter who told you that. It has a narrator, right? Intersectionality, social justice orientation, right? And we must move beyond just simply saying race is socially constructed towards asking race was socially constructed for whom and for what purpose? Because quantitative methods cannot mask bad theory. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. There it is. Thank you. So we have time for a few questions. If you're online, you can put it in the chat and I can read it out. Or if you're here in the room, I'm happy to bring you the mic.
This is, if I was going to do that, I would define your words by the few you've read the book and love to hear your thoughts.
It's inspired by racecraft.
It's nice because researcher like you, so I have 2 questions. So one is, here. And you're trying to separate intentional and non-intentional. Is there a way in which you found ways to separate the two and reinvent different expressions? Should we or should we not, basically? And I'm just going to do an analogy here. Mm-hmm. I'm from a part of the quant research that instead of racism as an X, as inequality, income inequality. And so in regressions, we see relationships, but usually it's better to study the processes through which this summary measure called income inequality, it's not the cause, it's the symptoms of processes that generate inequality and generate whatever outcome is correlated with it. And so I constantly argue against the use of inequality as an X. And if I transpose my reasoning to you, I would be arguing against the use of racism as the word or the concept as an X. So I'll just leave that to that question. So what do you think to that analogy? And
yeah, so to me, it's about framing. And the frame has to be carefully articulated because the process doesn't make sense outside of a framing. The absence of the framing is, I think, where a lot of quant scholars get in trouble with in terms of running the risk of reproducing race as an essentialist characteristic. So it's not like, I'm not thinking of this in terms of a pure measurement. I'm thinking of this in terms of a context specific that we have to, and I say we very loosely here, have to get the context and history right to make sense of the contemporary processes. And I hope I'm answering your question, but I do see racism as X, but it's manifested into different variables we can actually measure. So it's not about, so for example, education and family, I would use family structure, but I already used it. So when we think about education, the assumption, there's what Julian Gold refers to as Eurocentric universalisms, right? And how I interpret that is, if it works well for people racialized as white, then it must be universally right, right? And so when we do those analyses, even if we do interaction effect with race and education, let's say health, we don't see the same returns to education for people racialized as black and white, right? For me, that itself is the process of racism. It's manifested itself differently across these racialized groups because of that history that has shaped that contemporary. Does that make sense? So it's not like I'm looking for a variable called racism. Racism is the context in which human beings are, in the US context, are interacting, behaving, and experiencing the world. What Tukufu Zuberi calls, makes the argument that we're not controlling for race, we're controlling for experiences with racism, which is a very different way to make an argument about racial inequality. Because if it's just about race, then all you have to do is get into this category called education, called marriage, called employment, and we should be done with it. I'm going too far with this answer, but I hope that made sense. Sweet. Yes.
So I run narrowly defined regressions for a living, as do like most people in this building. So bear that in mind. That said, I am on board with you that it's really important to think about the context that you run the regression in. It could be social, economic,
Right.
diplomatic, historical, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Completely agree. What concerns me about, though, the critique of the narrow regressions is the following. So you could say, let's say I have some variable that explains some fraction of something. There are two reactions that might happen to that. One is deserved criticism, is that serves as kind of an excuse. I'm now, well, that's the problem. I don't need to worry about this other thing. And I think that's wrong because it forgot about the context. But that same regression might have been, and this probably was the intent of the researcher, was actually to say, I'm looking for something that might make a difference. Mm-hmm. If I found that there was some magic pill that reduced inequality and it were cheap and it was, came by bringing the floor up, I would say, wow, I'd really like to know that.
Yeah.
I think all of us would, right? And so what concerns me is a lot of this coming down hard on the narrow regressions as a feeder to excuse making.
I got you.
It suppresses the regression that serves the other purpose too. And I'm not sure the regression looks any different depending on those two outputs. Mm-hmm. You understand? It's not a question, it's a statement.
And I want to respond. My response would be to make that clear. That's it. I mean, that seems extremely straightforward and somewhat simple. But most research on racial inequality does not make that clear. So part of the debate with Professor Iceland is I'm making the argument, because it is not clear, how are you conceptualizing race to begin with? And why are these mechanisms the mechanisms that you care about, besides that they have variation across racial categories? So if we're explicit and upfront with our arguments, I think it reduces this kind of debate of critiquing quant methods in its own right, because it's just a tool, right? It has no magic power, it's just a tool. But how we frame the use of that tool matters. And that's as simple as I can get with that particular statement. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I unite with you on basically everything you said with this new or different epistemological approach to thinking about racism. My question is to your last bit that you had in response to Charlotte's question about you're not looking for a variable that's called racism, which I agree with you on this point, but I do want to sort of ask you about, right, there is a sort of movement to sort of think about measuring structural racism. And I just kind of want you to encourage or invite you to sort of talk about the risks, concerns we have with respect to that kind of measurement strategy vis-a-vis your approach that you laid out for us here today.
Sweet, that's awesome. Yeah, so I'm part of that camp too, because we have to start somewhere. And these particular measures are often these ratios, right, on a ton of measures that are getting at Black-white inequality, for example, and they are called structural racism measures, right? I think that work is incomplete, although I am a part of that camp. So much of my work is now trying to add bits of nuance to it. I'm not saying throw out the metaphorical baby with the bathwater, but rather be a more nuanced in our framing and theorizing so that those measures can then be seen as something a part of a larger system of inequality, and it just so happened to be racial inequality. Because you also have scholars who are doing structural patriarchy or structural sexism, right? And doing very similar thing with the ratios. I'm not going to critique those measures. I can. But I think the scholars are trying to move in a direction for the sake of finding the metaphorical smoking gun, if you will, for the persistence of racial inequality. All I want to do now that we have those measures, add a little bit of nuance and say these are necessary given the history and how that history is inexplicably linked to the contemporary. I hope I answered your question. Yeah. So I'm not going to get in a debate with you like, oh, I hate those things. No, I'm part of that camp. I'm a part of that camp. Thank you for asking.
We're just gonna have one last question. and
Oh,
then-
no.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I know.
Thank you so much for your talk. One question that I had was, you talk about the context of racism, but often people who are experiencing or having these experiences have intersectional identities. I know you kind of talked a little bit about how you try to stay away from the identities framing, but I'm wondering, how do you quantitatively and disentangle these different forms of prejudice that the same person could be experiencing and isolate racism versus everything else that's compounding? So for example, somebody who's racialized as Black might also be racialized as an immigrant, might also be racialized as, maybe they experience Islamophobia, for example, as well, depending on how they physically appear.
Right.
So I'm just kind of curious how you handle that in your research.
All right, so I'm smiling because I am actually writing a paper. I was invited to write a paper for a journal on intersectionality and quant methods. So I'm in the process of writing that paper, and I can give you everything that's in my head right now. It's gonna take a lot of time. But what I will say though, is that context, like Black Lives Matters, and that context becomes the driving force. And so I had a conversation with the group earlier, as you were mentioning that my kind of argument about identities, for example, I think there is a approach that we end up leapfrogging the structures to get to the identities, and we end up becoming Oprah, like you get an identity, you get an identity, you get an identity. Like, identities are salient only so much as structural inequality makes them salient. So my Black identity doesn't exist, cannot exist outside of the social construction of race, in which the idea of Black is seen as non-human and less than. So the civil rights movement gives us kind of these Black and beautiful, Black and proud as a response to oppressive structures, right? So there's nothing wrong with having dark phenotypical skin. It's a structure that gives it meaning. There's nothing wrong with being a woman or an immigrant. Structures, ideologies, and laws, policies, social practice, et cetera, gives it meaning. So the context in which you just laid out becomes very important, because those ideologies and structures are going to vary giving a specific context, right? And so I know I'm not answering your question, and I'm doing this on purpose because read the piece when it comes out, right? What I will say is that how we come to our studies emphasizing a particular context and how that context makes those particular identities that you just talked about salient. So we can talk about, on a certain set of conditions, being racialized as Black may be more salient. And on the next set of conditions, being an immigrant may be salient, right? So that context, and this is not, I'm not saying anything new. I think Crenshaw and others have made that argument as well, in that the context gives these identities some saliency, right? And one example I normally use, when I'm in predominantly Black spaces, being Black or being racialized as Black is not salient to me. When I'm in predominantly white spaces, it is very important to me, right? And so that context then gives meaning to the identity for a set of purposes, right? So I'm gonna leave it there. I hope I answered that, but we can talk later, okay?
Great.
I just did that. I'm not trying to blow you off. I'm just doing this. Just
Thank you
my
so much.
mannerisms.
Oh, sorry. If we can go ahead and give him a round of applause.
Great, thank you all so much. Sorry I took too much time.